When you stop distracting yourself, something unsettling happens almost immediately. A strange inner noise replaces the outer noise you removed. Thoughts get louder, emotions feel heavier, time slows down, and a quiet sense of disorientation creeps in. And most people misinterpret this moment as a problem, as confusion, as failure, or as losing direction. But the silent samurai understood that this feeling is not the collapse of the mind, it is the first honest signal the mind has sent in a very long time. Because distraction is not harmless entertainment, it is a shield, a sedative, a buffer that keeps you from encountering unresolved thoughts, unmet desires, suppressed emotions, and unanswered questions. And when that buffer disappears, the nervous system panics because it has lost its escape route. The brain has been trained for years to associate silence with danger and stimulation with safety. So when the stimulation stops, the body reacts as if something is wrong, even when nothing external has changed. And this is why the first phase feels like being lost, because your sense of identity was quietly tied to movement, noise, reaction, and constant engagement. And without those inputs, the structure collapses temporarily, leaving behind an unfamiliar internal landscape that feels empty only because it has never been explored consciously. And this is where most people turn back. They pick up the phone again. They fill the silence with podcasts, videos, conversations, tasks, or fantasies, not because they want entertainment, but because they are trying to restore familiarity, because familiarity feels like safety, even when it is destructive. But the silent samurai did not retreat at this stage because he recognized that the discomfort was not a threat, it was exposure. Exposure to the raw state of the mind, without filters, without anesthesia, without escape. And the reason this phase feels so intense is because distraction fragments awareness. It scatters attention across thousands of stimuli, so no single thought or emotion stays long enough to demand resolution. But when distraction is removed, awareness consolidates, attention turns inward, and whatever has been postponed begins to surface all at once. Unfinished emotions, unspoken truths, buried frustrations, abandoned ambitions, unresolved grief, and unacknowledged fear. And this sudden convergence overwhelms the untrained mind, making it feel like chaos, when in reality it is order returning too quickly for comfort. And this is why silence feels louder than noise at first, because silence does not compete with your inner world, it reveals it. And the silent samurai trained for this revelation deliberately, because warriors knew that a mind untested by silence would collapse under pressure, that a person who cannot sit with themselves without distraction will always be controlled by external forces, by impulses, by reactions, by circumstances, and by other people's emotions. And this is why modern minds struggle so deeply when distractions stop, because identity has been built through reaction rather than intention, through stimulation rather than stillness, through validation rather than alignment. So when the stimulation disappears, the identity has nothing to stand on, and the mind says, "I feel lost," but what it actually means is the false structure has fallen, and the real one has not yet been built. And this gap is uncomfortable because it exposes dependence, dependence on noise to feel alive, dependence on activity to feel valuable, dependence on distraction to avoid facing internal contradictions. And the silent samurai did not label this phase as confusion. He labeled it training. Because the nervous system must recalibrate, dopamine levels must normalize, emotional sensitivity must sharpen, and attention must relearn how to stay without fleeing. And during this recalibration, time feels slower, boredom intensifies, restlessness increases, and thoughts loop more aggressively. But this is not regression, it is withdrawal, the same way the body reacts when a sedative is removed. And if you endure this phase without escaping, something subtle begins to shift. Awareness becomes steadier. Emotional reactions become more visible, not stronger, but clearer.
patterns emerge, habits reveal their roots, and you begin to notice how often distraction was used not for pleasure, but for avoidance. Avoidance of uncertainty, avoidance of responsibility, avoidance of discomfort, avoidance of self-examination. And this is why the lost feeling is actually the mind reorienting itself without artificial landmarks, because when distractions guided your time, mood, and attention, they acted as false direction, telling you where to go next without asking what you actually want. But when those signals disappear, the mind must learn to navigate internally, and that process feels like being dropped into darkness without a map. Yet the darkness is not empty, it is simply unfamiliar. And the silent samurai never rushed this phase, because rushing would mean reintroducing noise, forcing meaning prematurely, clinging to borrowed identities or external scripts, and that would rebuild the same fragile structure that collapsed. And this is why patience is critical here, because clarity does not arrive through force, it arrives through presence, and the only task in this phase is endurance without escape, sitting with boredom without numbing it, observing thoughts without chasing them, allowing emotions without suppressing them, and resisting the urge to label the experience as wrong, because the mind is learning how to exist without constant stimulation, how to hold attention without scattering it, how to feel without immediately seeking relief. And this retraining is uncomfortable because it strips away the illusion of control distraction provided, replacing it with responsibility for one's inner state. And most people avoid this responsibility their entire lives, preferring noise to honesty, activity to clarity, and reaction to intention. But the silent samurai knew that the first step towards self-mastery is surviving silence without running, because once you can remain present without distraction, nothing external can control you again, not boredom, not loneliness, not uncertainty, and not other people's expectations. And this is why the shock of silence feels so destabilizing, because it is the first time the mind is truly alone with itself, without intermediaries, without masks, without filters, and that encounter exposes everything that distraction kept hidden, not to punish you, but to prepare you, because only what is revealed can be refined, only what is seen can be disciplined, and only what is endured can be mastered. And if you remain in this phase long enough without escaping, the lost feeling slowly transforms into neutrality, then into curiosity, and eventually into clarity. But that clarity belongs to the next phase, and the silent samurai never rushed towards it, because he understood that the shock of silence is not an obstacle on the path, it is the gate, and only those who pass through it without distraction earn the right to move forward.
After the initial shock of silence settles, a deeper and more unsettling phase begins, the phase most people quietly escape without realizing what they abandoned. Because this is the stage where the mind no longer panics, but instead opens a vast internal space that feels empty, heavy, and undefined. A void that does not scream for attention like anxiety does, but pulls at you with a slow, suffocating weight. And this is where people say they feel numb, unmotivated, disconnected, or hollow, believing something essential has disappeared, when in reality nothing has vanished. What has disappeared is constant stimulation, and without it, the mind finally has room to reveal what was buried underneath. Because the void is not empty space, it is unprocessed material, accumulated emotional residue that distraction prevented from surfacing. And the reason this phase feels so uncomfortable is because the mind prefers chaos to stillness, reaction to reflection, noise to honesty. And when the noise is removed, the subconscious takes its turn speaking, not in clear language, but in sensations, moods, flashes of memory, unexplained sadness, sudden anger, vague longing, and a persistent sense that something important has been neglected. And most people misinterpret this as depression or loss of purpose, but the silent samurai recognized it as backlog, the emotional and psychological backlog of years spent avoiding stillness, avoiding difficult questions, avoiding responsibility for inner alignment.
And this backlog does not surface gently. It arrives as a weight because it has been postponed for so long. And this is why the void phase feels heavier than the shock of silence, because now there is no panic to distract you from the material itself. You are simply left alone with it. And this is precisely where people retreat back into distraction, telling themselves they just need motivation, excitement, direction, or a new external goal, when what they actually need is to process what has been suppressed, because unprocessed emotions do not disappear, they accumulate. And when distraction ends, accumulation becomes confrontation. And this confrontation feels overwhelming because modern minds are not trained to sit with unresolved internal states without immediately seeking relief. And the silent samurai trained for this by understanding that the void is not an enemy, it is a threshold, a transitional space between an externally driven identity and an internally anchored one. And the reason the void feels purposeless is because old motivations were borrowed. They came from comparison, validation, habit, expectation, or fear. And when those drivers dissolve, there is a temporary absence of direction, not because direction is gone, but because it has not yet been redefined internally. And this is why the void feels like drifting without momentum, because the engine that once pulled you forward was external stimulation, not inner alignment. And when that engine stops, movement halts until a new source of energy is established. And the silent samurai never rushed to fill this void with artificial meaning, because filling it prematurely would only create dependence, replacing one distraction with another, one identity with another mask. And instead, he remained still, allowing the void to reveal its contents gradually. Because within that emptiness are clues, subtle signals pointing toward what actually matters, not in grand visions or dramatic realizations, but in quiet discomfort, recurring thoughts, persistent dissatisfaction with shallow pursuits, and an increasing intolerance for wasted energy. And this is why the void feels so heavy, because it removes illusions, illusions of progress, illusions of busyness, illusions of fulfillment. And without those illusions, reality feels stark, unpolished, and unromantic. And many people label this realism as negativity, when it is simply clarity without decoration. And the samurai accepted this clarity without judgment, knowing that only through honest assessment can true direction emerge. And during this phase, emotions may fluctuate unpredictably. Some days feel calm and neutral, others feel restless and dull. And this inconsistency scares people into thinking they are regressing. But this fluctuation is part of recalibration, the nervous system adjusting to baseline levels of stimulation, the psyche reorganizing priorities without constant interference. And this adjustment requires time, not answers, presence, not escape, and patience, not force, because the void does not respond to effort, it responds to endurance. And the more you try to escape it, the longer it persists, because escape reinforces avoidance, while endurance allows integration. And this is why the silent samurai viewed boredom not as a problem, but as a training ground. Because boredom forces the mind to confront its own patterns, revealing how quickly it seeks stimulation, how uncomfortable it is with nothing to react to, and how dependent it has become on external input to feel alive. And by observing this without judgment, the samurai weakened that dependency, slowly reclaiming control over attention, emotion, and impulse. And as this control increases, something subtle shifts. The void begins to feel less oppressive, not because it is filled, but because the mind becomes more comfortable existing without constant stimulation. And this comfort is power, because a mind that does not need distraction cannot be manipulated by it. And this is the true function of the void phase. It strips away compulsions, exposes dependency, and creates space for intentional direction to emerge later. And although this phase feels isolating, it is actually protective, because it filters out shallow desires, impulsive goals, and performative ambitions, leaving behind only what persists without external reinforcement. And those persistent signals, however faint, are the seeds of real purpose. But the silent samurai did not chase them yet, because chasing would turn them into another distraction. And instead, he waited, allowing the void to stabilize, trusting that clarity cannot be forced, only invited through stillness. And most people never reach this point because they misinterpret emptiness as absence, boredom as failure, and stillness as stagnation. But the silent samurai knew that stagnation is movement without direction, while stillness is preparation for precise movement. And if you remain in this phase long enough without numbing it, without dramatizing it, and without trying to escape it, the void stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like space. Space to think clearly, space to feel honestly, space to choose intentionally. And that transformation marks the end of avoidance and the beginning of self-authorship. And although the void phase feels like the darkest stretch of the path, it is actually the most honest, because nothing is hidden, nothing is masked, and nothing is borrowed. I never sought confidence directly. He sought proof through repetition, boredom, and controlled hardship, knowing that confidence would follow automatically. And the fourth thing discomfort builds is discipline, not the motivational kind, but structural discipline, the ability to act regardless of emotional state. And this is critical, because emotions are unstable by nature, and a life guided by emotion is a life vulnerable to fluctuation, while discipline creates consistency, and consistency creates progress. And discomfort is the training ground for discipline, because discipline only exists where resistance exists. Remove resistance, and discipline has nothing to grip. And comfort removes resistance everywhere it can, making discipline unnecessary and eventually unavailable. And this is why people in comfortable lives often struggle to maintain habits, not because they are lazy, but because their environment does not demand discipline, and what is not demanded does not develop. And the silent samurai structured his life so that discipline was always required in small ways, waking early, training regardless of mood, maintaining standards when no one was watching, because he knew that discipline decays without use. And the final thing discomfort builds is perspective, because discomfort reveals what matters and what does not, stripping away entitlement, expectation, and illusion. And when you endure difficulty voluntarily, gratitude becomes grounded, not performative, and priorities clarify naturally, because excess fades in the presence of effort. And comfort blurs this perspective, making small things feel important and important things feel optional. And this is why discomfort is often followed by growth, maturity, and humility, not because pain is noble, but because clarity is earned through friction. And the silent samurai never romanticized discomfort. He respected it as a teacher, knowing that every lesson comfort teaches is about avoidance, while every lesson discomfort teaches is about capability. And this is why people who train discomfort move differently. They speak less, react slower, and carry themselves with quiet certainty, because their strength is not theoretical, it is tested. And once strength is tested, fear loses authority, excuses lose credibility, and growth becomes inevitable. And this is the truth most people resist. Comfort may feel kind, but it builds nothing, while discomfort may feel harsh, but it builds everything you will rely on when life stops being gentle.
The silent samurai's discipline code was never about suffering, punishment, or forcing misery into life. It was about alignment, about choosing difficulty deliberately so that life would not choose it for him later. And this is where most people misunderstand discomfort. They think embracing discomfort means living in constant strain, but the silent samurai understood that controlled discomfort is precision, not chaos, and that discipline is not intensity, it is consistency, applied quietly over time. And the first rule of this code is to seek controlled discomfort daily, not extreme challenges, not dramatic suffering, but small exposures that train the nervous system to remain calm under resistance.
waking earlier than comfort prefers, completing tasks without waiting for motivation, finishing what is boring, repetitive, or mentally heavy, because boredom is one of the most avoided forms of discomfort, and yet boredom is where discipline is refined, because it removes stimulation and forces the mind to rely on structure rather than excitement. And the second rule is to remove unnecessary convenience, because convenience trains dependency, and dependency weakens capability. And the silent samurai did not reject comfort completely. He rejected unearned comfort, the kind that replaces effort rather than follows it. And this meant questioning habits that existed only to make life easier without making him stronger. Habits that saved time but cost awareness. Habits that reduced friction but also reduced growth. And by removing these conveniences selectively, he kept his edge sharp without living in deprivation. And the third rule was to train repetition without reward, because repetition is where most people quit, not because it is hard, but because it is unrewarded, unseen, and uncelebrated. And the silent samurai knew that mastery lives in repetition, long after enthusiasm fades. And by returning to the same discipline day after day without emotional payoff, he trained identity rather than motivation, becoming someone who acts because it is who he is, not because it feels good in the moment. And this is where comfort loses its power completely, because comfort feeds on novelty and relief, while discipline thrives on familiarity and structure. And the fourth rule was to stop optimizing comfort, because optimization is often disguised avoidance, a way to make difficulty more pleasant rather than more effective. And while optimization has its place, the silent samurai recognized that constantly adjusting conditions to feel better trains sensitivity, not strength. And by allowing conditions to be imperfect, uncomfortable, or inconvenient, he trained adaptability, which is far more valuable than control. And adaptability is what allows calm under pressure, clarity and uncertainty, and stability when plans collapse. And the final rule was to let discipline replace motivation entirely, because motivation is emotional and emotions fluctuate, while discipline is structural and survives fluctuation. And this shift is where true freedom appears, because when you no longer need to feel ready to act, action becomes inevitable, and growth becomes predictable, and comfort loses its leverage, because comfort relies on emotional negotiation, while discipline bypasses it completely. And the silent samurai lived by this code not because it made life harder, but because it made him unbreakable. And over time, discomfort stopped feeling like resistance and started feeling like alignment, like the natural state of growth. And comfort returned to its rightful place as recovery after effort, not a lifestyle. And this distinction changes everything, because rest that follows discipline restores strength, while rest that replaces discipline erodes it, and the silent samurai never confused the two. And this is the final truth you must understand. Comfort is not the enemy because it feels good. It is the enemy because it asks nothing of you. And a life that asks nothing slowly takes everything: clarity, resilience, self-respect, and purpose. While a life structured around disciplined discomfort gives back more than it demands: strength, calm, capability, and independence. And once you internalize this, you stop chasing comfort and start choosing readiness, knowing that discomfort is temporary, but capability is permanent. And this is where growth becomes inevitable, not because you are forcing it, but because you have removed the conditions that prevent it. And when comfort no longer dictates your decisions, fear loses its authority, excuses lose their credibility, and your life begins to move forward quietly, steadily, and without resistance, exactly the way the silent samurai intended. The final evolution beyond comfort, and even beyond discipline, is sovereignty. And the silent samurai understood that sovereignty is not control over others or circumstances, but command over the self when no one is watching, when there is no pressure, no reward, no immediate consequence. And this is where most people collapse back into comfort, because once discipline builds strength, comfort tries to reclaim authority by disguising itself as balance, self-care, or deserved rest. And the silent samurai anticipated this trap, because the most dangerous comfort is not the obvious indulgence, but the justified one, the kind that whispers, "You have earned it," that you can pause indefinitely now, that growth can wait. And this is why the final practice was not more hardship, but sharper awareness, the awareness to notice when comfort stops being recovery and starts becoming avoidance again. And this awareness is what separates temporary discipline from permanent transformation, because without it, even the strongest routines decay. And the silent samurai trained this awareness by placing himself regularly in moments of voluntary stillness, not rest filled with distraction, but silence without stimulation, where there was nothing to consume, nothing to escape into, and only the self remained, because silence reveals dependency faster than effort does. And in that silence, he could observe which urges arose first, the urge to check, to scroll, to eat, to stimulate, to numb, and each urge exposed where comfort still held power. And instead of resisting aggressively, he simply delayed, allowing the urge to rise and fall without action, training the nervous system to understand that discomfort does not require reaction. And this subtle practice rewired him more deeply than any intense discipline ever could, because it removed urgency from discomfort, and urgency is the fuel comfort feeds on. And as urgency disappeared, choice returned, and with choice came sovereignty. And this sovereignty changed how he moved through the world, because when you are no longer trying to escape discomfort, you stop rushing, you stop forcing outcomes, you stop chasing validation, and your presence becomes grounded, unreactive, and precise. And people can feel this immediately, not because of confidence displays or dominance, but because there is no desperation in your movements, no neediness in your decisions. And this calm authority is the true reward of transcending comfort, because it cannot be taken, manipulated, or shaken by external pressure. And the silent samurai protected this state fiercely by structuring his life so that ease was never automatic, so that effort preceded reward, so that clarity preceded rest, and so that recovery was intentional rather than habitual. And this structure created rhythm rather than rigidity, allowing flow without chaos. And this is where most people misunderstand the final lesson. They think the goal is to live hard forever, but the silent samurai lived deliberately forever, adjusting intensity without surrendering standards, knowing when to push and when to restore, without letting emotion decide either. And this is the balance most people seek but never find, because they search for it through feeling rather than structure. And feeling always bends toward comfort, while structure holds the line. And the silent samurai's structure was simple: daily effort that challenged the body or mind, daily silence that sharpened awareness, daily completion of at least one uncomfortable task without negotiation, and daily refusal to explain himself to anyone who did not share his path. Because explanation is often another comfort mechanism, a way to relieve internal tension by external validation. And by removing that habit, he sealed his sovereignty completely, acting without announcement, progressing without applause, and resting without guilt. And over time, comfort lost its seductive voice entirely, becoming just another sensation rather than a command. And this is the state you are being trained toward, not suffering, not intensity, not aesthetic discipline, but quiet self-command, the ability to choose effort when ease is available, to choose stillness when stimulation is everywhere, and to choose progress when no one is watching. And once you reach this state, growth stops feeling like a battle and starts feeling like momentum, because nothing inside you is pulling in the opposite direction anymore. And this is the final truth of the silent samurai path. Comfort is not defeated by force, it is rendered irrelevant by sovereignty. And when sovereignty becomes your baseline, life stops testing you with temptation, because temptation only exists where there is internal conflict. And when conflict dissolves, the path forward becomes clear, steady, and unavoidable. And from that moment on, growth is no longer something you chase, it is simply what happens when you move through the world with disciplined awareness and unshakable self-command.